Good morning, and welcome to the University of Adelaide for the third Sir John Downer oration. This year's oration is to be delivered by the Honourable Julie Bishop MP, Minister for Foreign Affairs. My name is Professor Jenny Shaw and I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide. It gives me great pleasure to act as your MC today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and of the land on which the University of Adelaide campuses here at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. I would also like to acknowledge the Honourable Julie Bishop MP, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Professor Mike Brooks, Interim Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Adelaide, former Premier of South Australia, the Honourable John Olsen, former Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, the Honourable Robert Hill, AC, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party in South Australia, Vicky Chapman, MP, Mayor of the City of Playford, Glenn Doherty, and the Honourable Cathy Branson, QC, Deputy Chancellor and other members of University Council, and members of the Downer family, represented today by Georgina Downer. We're delighted to have Rosemary Wanganeen here with us this morning to deliver the Welcome to Country. Rosemary is a proud South Australian Aboriginal woman. Her traditional heritage on her paternal side is Kaurna of the Adelaide Plains, and on her maternal side, Kookatar and Wirringo, both of the west coast of South Australia. Equally, she has a proud English heritage. In 1993, Rosemary was the founding CEO of the Sacred Site Within Healing Centre, and in 2005, she established the Australian Institute for Loss and Grief. Through these organisations, she helps others as an educator, presenter, facilitator, and loss and grief counsellor. In recent times, Rosemary's work has brought her many accolades, including as finalist in the South Australian Mental Health Excellence Awards in 2016. Rosemary's work also featured on SBS's Our Stories, Our Way just recently. Rosemary plays an important role here at the university too. She's a Kaurna Culture Advisor with Wilto Yellow, which is the university's key internal unit focusing on providing support to Indigenous students during their time at the University of Adelaide. In her role with Wilto Yellow, Rosemary is a welcoming face to new students, in addition to providing support and advice to students on a range of cultural, personal and academic issues. It gives me great pleasure to invite Rosemary to come forward and formally welcome you to Kaurna land.
Wow, great audience. So thank you so much, Professor Shaw, for your generous introduction, and to Rachel, Leah, Alana, Grega, for inviting me to do a Kaurna Welcome to Country. So recently I found out there isn't actually a Kaurna word for the word welcome, so we say Namani. And Namani asks you all as a group, are you good? I do this because I want to stay as true as I can to Kaurna language, since the National NAIDOC theme for 2017 says, our languages matter. Because of history, many modern non-Aboriginal Australians may not be aware that many modern Aboriginal Australians can't speak their traditional languages, which I am one of them. However, this doesn't mean I can't welcome you all to Kaurna country, or as an individual. It just means there is a different way of saying welcome. So to you all, Namani, and I hope you're all good. And still in the NAIDOC theme, to welcome an individual, I say Ninamani, are you good? So to the Honourable Miss Julie Bishop, Namani. Preparing for the welcome had me thinking about the modern day foreign affairs and trade portfolio, and I realised traditional Aboriginal cultures would have had developed beliefs, concepts, understandings and practices for a traditional foreign affairs and trade portfolio. Traditional Aboriginal culture had many systems. That was not obvious when 1788 arrived. Traditional culture didn't have tangible infrastructure for apparatuses, machinery, and to store written policies, practices and procedures, but they did have them. They were just stored in the land or as sacred sites or landmarks. Most important, they stored policies, practices and procedures cognitively. And in its broadest terms, I've chosen a few that I believe would have been needed for the foreign affairs and trade pre-1788. So I've chosen 4 systems. 1. Science and technology for personal use and trade amongst neighbouring tribes. So science and technology would have been things like boomerangs and spears, and there was a way of using science to develop them, prototype after prototype, until how they were used and the purpose that they were used for worked. So then it became technology. 2. Law and justice to reduce corruption in trading and science and technology. 3. Land and aquaculture to maintain border control. You see, traditional Aboriginal culture wouldn't allow people to come and go into other people's country without protocols in place, and breaking such laws triggered laws and justice. So a person could be speared and using it, doing it inappropriately and consistently, most certainly could have been death. 4. Trade and commerce for import into traditional groups and export into other traditional groups for personal and ceremonial purposes. So further to this, I visited Wikipedia, curious about how it explains the Foreign Affairs and Trade portfolio, and it says, the Minister is responsible for overseeing the international diplomacy section of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And diplomacy stood out, which means the conduct of government officials, of negotiations and other relations between states. So in the context of diplomacy, the modern day Australia's Foreign Affairs and Trade portfolio was thousands of years old in the law of the land before 1788 arrived. So not having intangible infrastructure meant my ancestors were still highly evolved intellectually and spiritually, and it meant it didn't detract them from maintaining human relationships and connections to their spiritual ancestors. This is why I'm so very proud to be here today and proud of my heritage. For those that aren't aware, Kaurna territory is far and wide. Imagine a wheel, and the city of Adelaide is the hub, and the spokes extends to Crystal Brook, 2 hours north of Adelaide, down in a southeasterly direction to Clare, about 1.5 hours from Adelaide, further south to Gawler, then follow the foothills of Mount Lofty Ranges down the south coast to Cape Jervis on the Fleurieu Peninsula, about 1.5 hours from Adelaide, and back up to Crystal Brook. So when you walk upon Kaurna country, gently place your footprints so as to minimise any harm to her. My welcome acknowledges my gratitude for the sharing of modern Australia. However, I express my deepest sadness for the cost of this sharing, but realising I hope it'll always be, we all have a right, a role and a responsibility to be part of the reconciliation process. In so doing, we can move forward to a place of equity, justice, and in partnership together as a modern Australia, and for future generations to come as one nation under our great Southern Cross. Similarly, as one nation, we have come a long way, together with the resistance really being minimal. But I'm confident we all know we still have some ways to go, and this welcome is another step forward. Thank you again, and I welcome you to Kaurna country.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. I would now like to invite the Interim Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Mike Brooks, to welcome you to this event.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you, Rosemary. I wish I had time to talk about some of the remarkable research that is happening at the University of Adelaide in terms of understanding how the First Peoples entered this country, research that confirms that the connection with the land of our First Peoples is more intimate and knowledgeable and sustained than any other on the planet, almost certainly. It is incredible research. It's also done hand in hand with the Aboriginal community here, Uncle Lewis and others, and it's phenomenal work. Another time, perhaps. Published in Nature in March, if you want to check it out. the Honourable Julie Bishop, the Honourable Robert Hill, former Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, Deputy Chancellor Cathy Branson, former Premier John Olsen, and many other distinguished guests that I will offend by not mentioning them. I hope not. But ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to the 2017 Sir John Downer Oration. This is a very special event in the University of Adelaide calendar. I want to particularly acknowledge the Downer family who have contributed so much to our university, to our state and to Australia. We established the oration in 2012 as a public lecture in honour of former South Australian Premier Sir John Downer. Sir John Downer was a highly distinguished South Australian, a leading barrister before he entered politics. Throughout his political career, he pursued a range of social reforms, including the Married Women's Property Act in the early 1880s and in federal parliament opposing the White Australia policy. He was twice Premier of South Australia, then served a term in the new federal parliament as one of the first South Australian senators. Returning to South Australian politics in 1905, where he served in the Legislative Council until his death in 1915. Beyond these public offices, Sir John also played a major role in the constitutional debates of the 1890s. Together with Edmund Barton and Richard O'Connor, he was responsible for drafting the Australian Constitution during the 1897-98 Constitutional Convention here in Adelaide. Today we are delighted to warmly welcome back to our campus the Honourable Julie Bishop to present the Sir John Downer Oration. As we shall hear shortly, our Foreign Minister has already made an outstanding contribution to our nation and is a wonderfully fitting presenter. As a graduate of this university and a recent recipient of an honorary doctorate, the Minister is no stranger to our campus and is also wonderfully welcome. We look forward greatly to Bishop's insights today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Minister Bishop has served as the member for Curtin in the House of Representatives since 1998. She was sworn in as Australia's first female Foreign Minister on the 18th of September 2013, following 4 years in the role of Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. As Minister for Foreign Affairs, among many achievements, Minister Bishop has overseen the single largest expansion of Australia's overseas diplomatic presence in 40 years and has introduced the new Colombo Plan to support Australian undergraduate students to study and undertake internships in the Indo-Pacific region. And we are very grateful to her for the opportunities that have been provided to so many of our students through that program. Minister Bishop has strengthened Australia's key strategic and economic relationships and enhanced Australia's engagement with Pacific Island countries, including normalising relations with Fiji, leading international recovery and reconstruction efforts in Vanuatu, and establishing a school of government in Papua New Guinea. And we watched on in admiration as she represented and continues to represent Australia and Australian victims in the aftermath of the Malaysian Airlines MH17 disaster. Before entering Parliament, Minister Bishop was a commercial litigation lawyer at Perth firm Clayton Utz, becoming a partner in 1985 and managing partner in 1994. Minister Bishop is, of course, an alumna from the University of Adelaide, having graduated with a Bachelor of Laws in 1978, and in May this year, as Mike mentioned, the University was delighted to award an honorary doctorate to Minister Bishop to acknowledge her outstanding contribution to Australian politics. So it gives me great pleasure to invite the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Julie Bishop MP, to deliver the third Sir John Downer Oration. Thank you, Julie.
Deputy Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, Dean, other representatives from the University of Adelaide, the Honourable Robert Hill, the Honourable John Olsen, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, Vicky Chapman, the Downer family, represented by Georgina, and distinguished guests all. Ladies and gentlemen, it is so good to be home in Adelaide, at my university, and you'll forgive me if I note a family link today. My sister Mary Lou is in the front row next to my brother-in-law Joe Verco, and it's wonderful to be in this beautiful building that was opened earlier this year with a substantial contribution from the federal government, but also through Joe Vercoe's philanthropic heart. There is a lecture theatre here, the Joe Vercoe Lecture, so I'm very delighted to have my family here. And while I'm on family links, I can't resist retelling an anecdote, and it's true, about the Bishop Downer connection. Many years ago, after I graduated with a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Adelaide, I was thinking about my future career, and I contemplated foreign affairs. And my mother said, "I know just the person you need to talk to." And she arranged an interview for me with a junior officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Adelaide. Now, I attended that interview, and I don't exactly recall what young Alexander Downer and I spoke about, but I suggest that neither of us would have imagined that he would end up as Australia's longest-serving foreign minister. I would follow him as the next coalition foreign minister, and he is now my High Commissioner in London, following in the footsteps of his father, Sir Alec Downer. I'm delighted to deliver the third Sir John Downer oration, and I acknowledge the first two orations by then Prime Minister John Howard in 2012 and then Prime Minister Tony Abbott in 2014. As Mike indicated, Sir John Downer began his storied career as a brilliant scholar, a lawyer who became a barrister in 1868 at the age of 24 and a Queen's Counsel in 1878 at the age of 34. In the same year, he was elected to the House of Assembly as the member for Barossa, a position he held until 1901. A highly regarded Attorney General in the John Bray government and leader of the opposition for much of the 1890s, Sir John held the high office of Premier of South Australia twice, from June 1885 until June 1887, and again from October 1892 until June 1893. He was elected a senator for South Australia in 1901. John, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? And held that position until resigning from federal political life in 1903 and resuming state political life. However, his legacy has lived on through his son Alec, his grandson Alexander, and hopefully his great-granddaughter. Although Sir John was a member of state and federal parliament for 37 years of his life and remained undefeated through 11 elections at both levels of government, I have to say, those were the days. Sir John was one of the earliest supporters for the right of women to vote and suffered much criticism, indeed heckling, during his time in public life for defending that position. So it's appropriate that the Downer oration takes place within the University of Adelaide, which was the first Australian tertiary institution to admit women to undergraduate degree studies. Sir John played a leading role at the conventions in the years prior to the founding of our federation in 1901. A champion of preserving the role of the states in any future Commonwealth, he served on the drafting committees at the 1897-1898 convention and emerged as a most powerful advocate for entrenching a proper role for the High Court in the Constitution. Sir John's remarks made during the 1898 convention on the future judiciary of the Commonwealth are still quoted by students and academics of jurisprudence to this day. Quote, "With them rests the obligation of finding out principles which are in the minds of this convention in framing this bill and applying them to cases which had never occurred before and which are very little thought of by any of us." As his biographer John Bannon concluded in examining the work of Sir John, he can claim a longevity in the cause of the Australian Federation which was unmatched by any other member. We gather for this oration 102 years after his death to remember Sir John as a remarkable leader with a powerful vision for our Commonwealth. Much of Sir John's distinguished career was spent debating how the Australian national government ought be organised, the privileges and limitations placed on state and federal executive power, and more broadly, how Australians ought to be governed. The task of balancing the competing interests of the states must have been formidable. Forgive me, as a Western Australian, acutely aware that my state currently receives 34 cents in every dollar of GST raised, but I can't help but wonder how Sir John would have managed the equitable distribution of the GST among states and territories. As an elected Member of Parliament and therefore a custodian of the Australian Constitution, I'm mindful that executive power must be acquired legitimately and wielded as wisely, responsibly and sparingly as possible. Sir John and his contemporaries took on the serious responsibility of crafting a constitution that would serve as the bedrock of a Commonwealth that would work to the benefit of all its citizens. The Constitution set out the various responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government and the states and provided a framework within which each level of government was to operate. Importantly, it allocated equal numbers of senators to each state, regardless of their relative populations. This feature, reflecting the composition of the US Senate, was designed to protect the interests of the less populous states. In many respects, the Constitution and subsequent work of Parliaments and the High Court have established a set of rules for Commonwealth state and state-state interactions. Later this year, I'll release the government's foreign policy white paper, the first since 2003, when Foreign Minister Alexander Downer released Advancing the National Interest. The 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper will seek to establish a framework that will guide Australia's international engagement in a less certain and more contested world over the next decade. It will give the government and Australians guidance with respect to how we maximise and exercise power and influence, and for what purpose, and how we seek to protect and enhance the interests and values of Australians through our engagement abroad. When it comes to the judicious use of executive power and national resources, a principled foreign policy is not so different from the domestic context. Sir John had a profound interest in the proper purpose of executive government and the objectives of deploying national power and resources. Our upcoming white paper will explain the rationale for our international engagement and the utilisation of our national capabilities overseas. The white paper is an opportunity for the government and for Australians to reflect on the foundations of our security and our well-being in an uncertain region and world. It's to our credit as a nation that Australia has set yet another world record. We are entering our 27th year of continuous economic growth, unmatched by any other advanced economy. We've weathered the Asian financial crisis. We got through the dot-com boom and bust of 2000, the global financial crisis of 2008. We survived the vagaries of the international commodities cycle. There's a generation of Australians who have not known a recession and are focused on the pursuit of even greater prosperity. And in the serene surroundings of this beautiful campus, it's easy to take for granted the conditions under which peace and prosperity become possible. The era since the Second World War has come to be known as the Long Peace, and that is largely due to the international rules-based order, the laws and the rules and the norms established over that time, championed and promoted and defended by the United States and its allies to a large extent. It's not possible to have one guiding international document, such as our Constitution, to set out these rules, given the issue of nation-state sovereignty. However, there's a rich tapestry of international law to guide the behaviour of nations, particularly towards each other, to help resolve disputes peacefully. The international rules-based order is currently under stress and is being challenged by states and non-state actors. So the importance of preserving and maintaining the international rules-based order is one of the fundamental principles that will shape the content of our white paper. The rules-based order is built on many of the liberal democratic precepts that have underpinned our domestic political life and our economic success. Its basic principle is the rule of law, where governments, firms and individuals enjoy rights and obligations regardless of wealth or power, so larger or smaller, stronger and weaker states can coexist constructively and peacefully if all nations abide by the laws and the rules and the norms. So a country of over 1 billion people, China or India, is deemed to have the same rights and privileges of Tuvalu, a population of 11,000 people, or Australia with just under 25 million. Now, I'm not naive when it comes to the reality of strategic or economic competition that exists, especially in our region. Competition is an accepted feature of international relations. However, it must be conducted fairly so as not to descend into conflict. Australia has been a key supporter of this order from our early engagement with the United Nations, including as the first nation to hold the presidency of the UN Security Council. A fortnight ago in New York, I delivered a statement to the United Nations General Assembly Annual Leaders' Week, where I championed reform of the United Nations to ensure it is still relevant, that it becomes more accountable and responsive and efficient to undertake the important work for which it was created. If the United Nations did not exist today, we would have to establish it. Australia has supported many of the legal frameworks, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the International Criminal Court, and more. So take the South China Sea. When the Tribunal of the Permanent Court of Arbitration under UNCLOS released its decision favouring the Philippines in the contested South China Sea in July of 2016, Australia called on both China and the Philippines to treat this as final and binding on both parties. We were probably the most insistent and robust of any country in the world in upholding the authority of the tribunal, and I'm well aware of how that was received in certain capitals to our north. Even though Australia doesn't take sides in the territorial dispute between China and the Philippines and others, we believe the tribunal's decision is authoritative. It articulates international law and the law of the sea in particular. As an island continent and a trading nation, freedom of navigation and overflight is utterly fundamental to our security. We'll work with like-minded countries to defend the rules-based order and dissuade others seeking to undermine it. The most egregious violation of international law and order at the present time is North Korea's flagrant disregard of 8 United Nations Security Council resolutions demanding that it abandon its illegal weapons and ballistic missile programs. We've been vocal in our support of the actions of the United States in persuading the Security Council to adopt even harsher economic sanctions against North Korea in order to compel Pyongyang back to the negotiating table with the intention of ensuring it abandons its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. We've been amongst the most vocal in the world, urging the international community and the permanent 5 members of the Security Council in particular, which includes China and Russia, to fully impose tough sanctions, and sanctions that will affect the elites as much as possible. If North Korea's illegal programs are left unchecked, if North Korea achieves its aspirations, there will be significant implications. The authority of the UN Security Council will be diminished, as well as the standing of the permanent 5 members. It will increase the prospects of international disorder. The United States will have no option but to increase its military presence in the region. South Korea and Japan will feel more threatened and vulnerable and will need to take deterrent action. And what of other aspiring nuclear states? Iran, and how would Saudi Arabia respond? Australia cannot stand apart from this regional threat to our security. We must play an active role in defending the authority of the United Nations Security Council and compelling Pyongyang back to negotiate a peaceful outcome. We've imposed our own autonomous sanctions to complement the UN Security Council measures. Australia has done so out of principle and respect for international law and order, as well as our own security. Similarly, Australia has called out Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine and the illegal annexation of the Crimea. Standing on principle and speaking truth to great powers can be challenging. We do so because the defence of international law and the rules-based order provide the conditions for all countries to benefit and thrive. Over the past 70 years, this rules-based order has allowed developing nations to grow. China's economic rise has been one of the miracles of our time, with hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. That occurred only after China gradually opened itself to the world and became a participant in the global order, rather than opposing it or standing apart from it, as occurred prior to its reforms from 1979. The economic success of Japan, South Korea, Singapore and others has been achieved during this era. Other nations in our region are experiencing rapid growth. India and Myanmar are currently the fastest growing economies. Our relationships with our region are warmer and more comprehensive than ever. Meanwhile, we maintain our close partnership with the United States, the nation that has done more than any other in terms of safeguarding international peace and security. As I travel through the region and around the world, I'm constantly reminded of the high regard in which Australia is held, particularly in our region, in the capitals and institutions such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Australia has never been more influential. That we are is due in no small part to the clarity and consistency of how we pursue our interests and promote our values. Our reputation that I seek to promote and to protect is as an open, liberal democracy, committed to freedoms, the rule of law and democratic institutions, as an open, export-oriented market economy, committed to trade and investment around the world. That's why we're the 13th largest economy in the world. Additionally, our government is placing paramount importance on ensuring our government and our domestic institutions remain free from undue foreign influences or coercion. This is to ensure those responsible for making decisions or carrying out duties on behalf of Australians can make decisions solely based on the best interests of our country. Our white paper will reflect Australia's growing influence, and it will be ambitious in its outlook and its goals. We'll develop our national strengths and capabilities, leverage our relationships with the great powers and key regional states, and take advantage of our expanding diplomatic presence to champion the rules-based order and policies that will continue to underpin Australian, regional and global security and prosperity. In addition, the White Paper will seek out practical ways to make a tangible contribution to expanding Australian capabilities in the national interest. But we can't be complacent, nor can our allies and partners and friends. In 1988, Paul Kennedy of Yale University released his magnum opus, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. In a grand sweep of economic and military history from 1500 to the year 2000, Professor Kennedy examined the material causes of the rise and fall of great ruling families, nations, and empires. He began from the truism that wealth is generally needed to underpin military power and strategic influence, and analysed the way nations and governments overreach, for example, territorial acquisition or participation in wars. His analysis was masterful and thorough. The rise and fall of the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, and the British Empire, to name several, are examined in impressive detail. He convincingly argues that strategically and politically reaching beyond one's economic grasp is a harbinger of decline. Yet the qualifications contained in his analysis are as important as the main thesis itself. The relative and absolute rise and decline of nations and national economies depend on the effectiveness of leaders and the flexibility and resilience of political organisations and national institutions. The professionalism and efficiency of one's military is significant, as is national morale. As during the Industrial Revolution, adapting to technological change and shifting markets will determine the fate of economies and therefore nations. It's obviously not an exact science because Professor Kennedy, along with almost every other expert, failed to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union only 3 years after the release of his study, and the economic revival of the United States economy and its global leadership in the technology revolution that's underway. And he didn't quite pick the remarkable rise of China following land reforms in the 1980s and the opening up of its economy to the world when it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. But my point is that the economic and strategic destiny of every nation is dependent on the decisions made by its leaders and its people. For our part, there's no sign that Australia is in danger of strategic overreach or imminent economic turmoil, quite the contrary. However, warnings about relative decline can apply to all nations. We can't take our growth in capability and strength for granted. Just consider the disruption from the scale and pace of technological advances. We're entering the fourth industrial revolution, or what many experts call the second machine age. In this age, the disruptive effects of advanced manufacturing technologies, robotics, automation, 3D printing, and exponential improvements in artificial intelligence will make many traditional jobs and industries obsolete. Some predictions are that within a decade, 1/3 of jobs in existence now are at risk of being replaced by software, robots, and smart machines. And we're told about 60% of school children around the world will be working in jobs and industries that have not yet been created. Disruptive change will impact almost every sector and every economy over time. And during every identified industrial revolution, the national strengths and capabilities of countries shifted dramatically in relative terms, depending on the ability of their government and their economies to respond or not. We're a nation of nearly 25 million people in a region of growing military and economic weight. Australia's interests lie in continuing to champion an open global economic and trading system, to adapt quickly to technological change, to embrace innovation and take advantage of the opportunities unfolding in the region, such as the massive rise of a middle class, a consumer class in Asia that is eager to purchase quality goods and services. We must advocate, all of us, for the continuing opening of our economy to fair competition, to find new and enhance existing markets for our goods and services. We have to attract skilled workers from all over the world to enhance our productivity and build our capacity. We must maintain public confidence in the steady flow of foreign capital that enables us to build our economy, and we must work tirelessly to achieve regional stability. If we do all these things well, we'll continue to advance national prosperity and accumulate the means and influence to further advance our interests. This will allow us to become an even more effective champion of the international rules-based order. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sir John Downer made it his life's work to promote a principled constitutionalism for our Commonwealth. He advocated for a proper and pragmatic relationship between executive authority, law, institutions, and public ethics and accountability, even allowing for the differences between the domestic and international environs. This strikes me as an apt description of the principled foreign policy I am advancing. I hope Sir John would have approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Articulate and stimulating as always. It is now my great pleasure to ask Georgina to come forward and on behalf of the Downer family and the audience here today, deliver a vote of thanks. Thanks, Georgina.
Thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be here today on behalf of the Downer family to deliver this vote of thanks. My father has been waylaid in London. Of course, his boss is here and he wouldn't want to be scarving off the job, so has left the task to me. The Honourable Julie Bishop, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Deputy Leader of the Federal Liberal Party, is, like me, an export of the Adelaide Hills. And as a young woman growing up, watching Julie Bishop's career go from strength to strength, it was incredibly inspirational, and it's lovely to think that we grew up in those the rarefied air of those Adelaide Hills. You at a cherry farm, I think it was, cherry orchard, and me in a, well, not quite so salubrious. And you may be a self-declared West Australian now, but I think the way you carry about your task as a representative overseas, I think we would all agree in this room, you do it with an Adelaide style and class that is without any competition around the world. As the Minister and the Interim Vice-Chancellor, Mike Brooks, have mentioned, my great-grandfather, Sir John Downer, was a founding father of Australia and very involved in the writing and drafting of our Constitution, a key figure in South Australian politics. And he was very much committed to that idea of Australia as an independent nation. But he was also extremely committed to South Australia and preserving South Australia's place in a federal Australia. And John Bannon, a former Premier of this state, wrote a beautiful biography of Sir John Downer called Supreme Federalist, which really explains that commitment to this state and to that particular system, which is partly modelled on the United States system. But I think the product of the constitutional conventions that Sir John Downer was involved in the late 19th century have delivered us a really fantastic model, which has, had its challenges, and the Minister will be well aware of the difficulties of discussions at COAG between the federal and state governments, but I think has been one of the great successes of Australia, making sure that smaller states and larger states all have their fair say in the direction of this country. I think also the importance of this lecture is that it reminds us of our history. It's so often forgotten. We get caught up in the day-to-day rough and tumble of politics or world affairs. And of course, as the Minister has explained today, we are in an incredibly contested period of history, an inflection point that many people have pointed to with the rise of China, with North Korea, sabre rattling, and of course continuing troubles in the Middle East. We reflect though on our history and what makes us a nation, what brings us all together, and it was beautiful welcome to country. I do thank you very much, Rosemary, for that, reminding us of our Indigenous history, modern Australian history, and of course how that impacts our present day. I'm very much, as a foreign policy tragic, I was an employee of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for almost 10 years and served in Japan, so very close to the North Korean problems. I'm very much looking forward to the release of this white paper, 10 years since the last one. As the Minister so eloquently put in a thoughtful way, there are going to be a lot of known unknowns, and even the great was it Paul Kennedy was unable to predict everything that came about in the last 30 years. But the importance of these white papers are that they do set the stage for a set of principles and values that will guide nations, important nations like Australia, in our adventures and how we deal with challenges overseas, always promoting our national interest. And I think with a Minister of the quality and calibre, such as the Honourable Julie Bishop, we are incredibly well served and represented. And I would like to encourage you all to join me in clapping out of applause for the Honourable Julie Bishop. Thank you. And I'd now like to present the Honourable Julie Bishop with a copy of The Supreme Federalist, the biography of Sir John Downer.
Thank you, Georgina. As Georgina mentioned, she's presented the Minister with The Supreme Federalist, The Political Life of Sir John Downer, which was written by former South Australian Premier, the late Honourable Dr John Bannon AO, who was also a much valued alumnus of this university. The publishers of the book, Wakefield Press, will be selling the book in the foyer. There's always that at the end, you know that. So if you'd like to have a look at the book and perhaps purchase a copy, there will be copies available for purchase at the end of this event, and I would encourage you to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the oration event this year. Can I thank you all again for joining us today, and especially our orator, the Honourable Julie Bishop. Thank you.